So we've seen an interesting evolution in terms of what we understand by Arctic and Antarctic security, where traditionally this was just state-based actors asserting their interests. And what I think we've seen on the one hand is very much a shift in terms of what we understand by security, even in terms of military security. But we've also seen a shift generally in other dimensions of security that are showing up. For instance, if we think about environmental security, issues related to climate change and to pollution, so these are challenges that no one state can solve within their jurisdiction, and so those have required greater cooperation and collaboration to address. And at the same time, we've seen a proliferation of different actors, where previously it was just largely state-based actors. We're now seeing a variety of actors at different levels, so it's becoming more of a multi-level governance problem. And so the question then is, how do we best address these challenges? Do we use strictly functional arrangements? Do we use multilateral arrangements that are entrenched in instruments of international law and thereby perhaps enjoy greater legitimacy? And so the objective here of having a conversation across the two poles is that many of the challenges we're facing are quite similar in terms of opportunities for cooperation, competition, or even potential conflict, the tensions that might arise between exploitation versus the status quo with regards to resources, the role of sub-state, international, and transnational governance arrangements. And so the hope here is that we can identify what are the commonalities and what are the differences between the Arctic and Antarctic, and identify opportunities for greater collaboration, especially across countries that might not physically be adjacent, but that by virtue of their long-standing collaboration when it comes to international peace and security and prosperity, but also by virtue of the fact that they share, as part of the Anglosphere and part of the Five Eyes community, Australia, Canada, along with the United Kingdom, US, New Zealand, share a common set of values that ultimately inform those interests, explore greater opportunities for collaboration that go beyond mere realist interests and transactional approaches to building more of a community where especially middle powers such as Australia and Canada can overcome the fallacy of composition, identify common ways forward, and pool their resources to achieve those objectives on either end of the globe. So I think the three key issues are cooperation, competition, and conflict, which is sort of the three basic premises, if you want, of international relations in this domain. This is not a domain where I think anybody really wants to have conflict, given that it's extremely harsh, it's extremely expensive, it's extremely difficult to do anything, and the resources required are quite exorbitant. At the same time, there's a real risk of spillover if there is tension or conflict, especially hostile conflict elsewhere in the world, where great power competition could ostensibly spill over into the polar regions. There's also the risk of much greater competition, in particular for resources. Due to demographic pressures, some 3 billion more people on the planet in the next 30 some odd years, that will produce considerable pressure on additional resources. We already see a country such as China being extremely aggressive when it comes to the exploitation of resources and the potential exploitation on the poles. And so trying to understand how we can generate rules and predictability when it comes to propensities for competition that might emanate from the great powers, because ultimately, as middle powers, our objective is for people to cooperate, to constrain the large powers, to generate predictability, and so to shore up the liberal institutionalist and multilateralist frameworks and functional approaches that we have built over decades in order to address challenges that affect all the states that have an interest in the polar regions. So from the perspective of Australia and Canada, which are countries with substantial security interests across the world, given that we are large countries with long coastlines, multiple strategic areas of interest, and yet relatively, in terms of population, small to medium-sized, lots of competition for how we allocate these resources, that we think more systematically about as I think the world is becoming a more challenging place in general, and a particular challenging place along the poles, given the much more rapid change in the polar regions, both to naturogenic phenomena, including the impact of climate change and pollution, but also anthropogenic phenomena, for instance, such as tourism and ostensibly greater fishing, bioprospecting, whatnot. As we're going to see much more rapid change on the poles than we're going to see in other regions of the world, there's opportunity here to be more systematic in coordinating across our countries and across our capitals to use the resources that we have on the policy side, on the operational side, on the strategic side, to maximum effect, to advance our collective interests and to focus on what brings us together rather than what divides us, and what may appear simply to be a Canadian interest in the Arctic or an Australian interest in the Antarctic as a result of all the dynamics that I've laid out, actually complementary interests where we have we want to make sure that we shore up the international rules-based order and an ordered and coordinated, predictable approach rather than being passed on the inside lane by great power competition or possibly conflict.